Okay, this is without a doubt going to be the most difficult and controversial vlog that I think I will probably make my entire time here in Ukraine during this war. And that is because I'm going to address some of the accusations that have been leveled by Russia against Ukraine, namely in terms of the presence of Nazis and fascists within Ukraine. And I'm going to address, at least in part of this video, the elephant in the room that is Stepan Bandera. So who is he? Who was he? This boogeyman that the Russians like to refer to all the time and say that this country is filled with what they call Banderovцы, or followers of Bandera. Well, Stepan Bandera was born in 1909 in what was, at the time, Polish-controlled, what was called Eastern Galicia. And he was, from a very early age, someone who showed militant attitudes. He was a member of a kind of a Boy Scout, but it was like a far more militant kind of Boy Scout troop. And he was indeed a Ukrainian nationalist, first and foremost. But he was a violent man. And he believed in overthrowing the Polish control of Eastern Galicia and wresting it into Ukrainian hands by violent means. He was arrested for the assassination of the interior of Poland and was thrown in prison. Originally he was given a death sentence, but that was commuted to life. But the thing about Bandera is his life history is murky at best, because, as is so many things with the history of Ukraine, you know, there's that saying that that history is written by the victors. So people who follow Bandera today, and yes, there are Ukrainians who follow Bandera, who think that Bandera was a national hero. Many times they will say to me, yes, but you know, the Russians twisted his history and made him into this evil person that he wasn't really. He just really wanted a free Ukraine. I disagree with that wholeheartedly, and so do many other Ukrainians. But I have to admit, obviously the Russians have manipulated the history of Bandera. They're doing it today. So think of what they did for all the decades of the Soviet Union, or heck, even just the last 20 years of Putin's reign. I don't think we'll ever get a really clear picture of who this man was, but there's no denying he was violent, and there's no denying that support for him is being used against the Ukrainians today in this war. In 1939, following the Molotov-Ribbentrop Agreement, where Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union split Poland in two, Bandera was released from prison and he went to go live in Krakow. And he formed what was called the OUN, the Organization for Ukrainian Nationhood. I also want to make one other quick point while I'm here. I've been here filming for about 20-30 minutes, openly talking about Bandera. I have not been stopped. Nobody has asked me what I'm doing. No police have arrived. And counter that with what we see happening in Russia today, where if you protest against this war, within moments, authorities will descend upon you and you will be hauled away. So again, the false equivalency that Russia and Ukraine are basically one and the same doesn't hold water with me. So how can it be that a guy like Bandera can be so revered in a country like Ukraine that says they want to be part of a liberal democracy? Well, I think in order to answer that, we need to take a little stroll down the street where this monument is located. So let's do that now, shall we? So, before I show you why we had to come down here, let me just point something out to you. What's the name of that street we just walked down? Well, you guessed it. It's named the Boulevard of Stepan Bandera. But that's not why we're here. No. We're here because, as is usual in Ukraine, there is a monument for everything. And that is what I intend to show you. Now, but this monument is very different than the monument to Bandera, upon which street they both lie. This monument is called the Monument to the Victims of Communist Crimes. I think it's important to take that into consideration here. During the Soviet Union, Ukraine suffered greatly. And Bandera was a victim himself of those crimes. He saw all around him during the 30s the crimes that Stalin committed here, most notably the Holodomor, in which 3 to 4 million people, his fellow countrymen, most probably family members, were starved to death on purpose by Stalin. A horrible way to die. And I think it's important to understand. To understand Ukraine, you have to understand generational pain. These people have suffered greatly, especially in the 20th century. They suffered under the Soviet Union, they suffered under Stalin, they suffered under the Germans and the Nazis. And that kind of pain doesn't just go away. It infects a nation and it infects a people. It doesn't justify acts of violence or crime or brutality. But can we at least acknowledge, please, that the Ukrainians have suffered and are traumatized and are fighting with everything they have in them because they know that if they fall victim to another greater power again, they will be the victims of more brutality. Look at Bucha. Look at Irpin. And soon, I'm sure, look at Mariupol. What you're looking at here is a mural at the Central Tram station in Lviv. It's to the memory of the heroes of Ukraine. On the left you have a current-day soldier standing in front of a Ukrainian flag, juxtaposed with a soldier standing in front of the flag of the UPA, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army from the Second World War. He is dressed in a German-style uniform, but with the Ukrainian symbols on his lapel, and he's carrying a Soviet-style submachine gun. There is a lot to unpack with just this one simple mural. But again, it exemplifies the depth and the complexity of this history. So I've come into this lovely little cafe here to get myself, to get out of the spring rain and get myself a little bit of coffee. In Lviv, there's always coffee. But speaking of Mariupol, it allows me to move on to the next big boogeyman in Russia's arsenal of propaganda that they use, and that is the Azov Brigade. And it's because at the time of this recording, the Azov Brigade is fighting a last-ditch effort to hold on to Mariupol. The Azov Brigade fought in Mariupol before in 2014, stopped the Russians there then. They also fought at the airport in Donbass, and for that they are heralded as heroes. Now I ran into some of these Azov guys back in 2014 when I was on the Maidan, and they were not good guys. They were, swastika tattoos, SS tattoos, the whole 9 yards. A lot of bad dudes. And I said to my friends back then, you guys have got to do something about that because, one, it's a cancer within your society, and two, it is red meat for the Russians in propaganda terms. And in fact, I think the Ukrainians were aware of that already. In 2015, the Rada, the Ukrainian parliament, passed a law banning propaganda, both from communist propaganda and from fascist propaganda, just nationwide. And they've done everything that they can to sweep the Azov brigade from Nazi elements, and by and large, they've actually done a pretty good job of it. One of the deputy commanders is a Georgian guy. They're not the same militia that they were in 2014. That's 8 years ago. Time marches on, not backwards. But when we talk about the history of Nazism and fascism within Ukraine, you can't deny that it was here. Also around the corner from here, there's a little market where you can buy the mementos from the past, and these are photos, probably reproductions, but photos of German soldiers rolling into Lviv and being greeted with the Heil Hitler salute. Beautiful, beautiful Ukrainian women in their lovely traditional Vyshyvanka costume, giving the Heil to the swastika and to Nazi officers there. I mean, that happened. And then when we talk about partisan warfare and militias like the Azov Brigade, there's a long history of it. I mean, these guys here, in uniform reminiscent of the NKVD, using Soviet weapons, but also kind of mixed in with that, some Nazi regalia there. Bandera set up an organization called the UPA, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army. It was the militant wing of his OAN, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalism, the OUN. And while he was in prison, and Bandera can't directly be held accountable for this, the UPA, the Insurgent Army, went through Polish villages and just burnt them to the ground, just indiscriminately killing Poles, because of course, Bandera held the idea that Poles were not welcome here in Ukraine, and he wanted to create this Ukrainian nationalist identity. We freak out when we hear nationalism, but what Ukrainians mean when they say I'm a Ukrainian nationalist is literally that. It doesn't mean they're nationalists in the way we think of it. It means I believe there should be such a thing as a Ukrainian nation. I think I've mentioned that before. But look, you can't ignore this fact. You can also buy this. I bought this at the market around the corner, okay? It's, disturbing, to say the least. I mean, there it is. The Nazi, swastika and the Nazi army above the Ukrainian trident symbol. So this guy signed up with the invading Nazis. Now, did he do it because he believed in Nazi ideology, or did he do it because he so hated the Russians and they had a common enemy? We'll never know. That guy's long gone. But you can't take into consideration this country's history, or indeed the far-right elements within this country, without taking into consideration that many of them would have signed up with the devil to fight against Russia. Russia has been suppressing the idea of Ukrainian nationhood for centuries, and often quite cruelly. It's not as easy as saying it's black and white. It's not easy. It's not as easy as just simply saying that Ukraine is filled with Nazis, or it's this liberal democracy just bursting out. It's a little bit of everything. As with so many things in this country, there's no easy answer. So there's my little cafe where I had my coffee and got out of the rain. The rain's abated a little bit, so I'm back out again. But there's a method to my madness. I did not choose that cafe at random. I chose it because I wanted to show you this shot, and it's this juxtaposition I think is really poignant. Through the portcullis there, you will see the flag, the black and red flag associated with Bandera and with the UPA, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army. But it's located on a street called, see it there, Old Jewish Street, Boulevard Staroyevreysky, Boulevard of the Old Jewish Boulevard. Now, why is it called the Old Jewish Boulevard? Well, it's because of this. This is where one of the oldest synagogues in Europe was located until 1942, when the Nazis burnt it down. First they shelled it, and then eventually they burnt it down to its foundations. And this plaque here marks that terrible event. You see it there. But this is a beautiful and very somber, very poignant monument. And it's pristine, you'll notice. There's no graffiti here. The monument has not been damaged. This is in the heart of Lviv. This is right in the center. And it's maintained, clearly, very delicately. And you see here in these stones quotes from people who may have survived that awful period in time. You see it in Ukrainian, English, and Hebrew. And of course also here we also have a little bit of Polish, because of course everything is mixed in. We see some Russian there as well. Layers upon layers upon layers, and complexities upon complexities upon complexities. And I think there are people, unfortunately, in the West who are being manipulated and buying into Russia's narrative, the propaganda that Russia is spreading, for very cynical purposes. They're using one of the great tragedies of the 20th century to muddy waters here and to justify what they're doing. And sadly, I think that's being picked up in the West in many places. But, Ukraine has a lot of different elements to it. I mean, is Britain fascist because there is the EDL? Is America fascist and Nazi because we had Charlottesville? By that metric, should Europe be invading America to denazify the USA? Nothing's easy here. But it is not what the Russians would have us believe it is. But let's get back to Stepan Bandera for a moment, and probably the most controversial period of his time. Let's talk about his actions during the Second World War, and in so doing, let's throw another log on the confusing fire that is the story of Stepan Bandera. What you are looking at here behind me is a plaque on the central square, on Market Square in Lviv, and it marks the signing in 1941 of a document that the OUN signed, called the Act of Restoration of the Ukrainian State. Signed on June 30th of 1941, in that brief little window of opportunity between when the Germans were pulling out, but the Russians had not yet arrived. Now, when the Germans did arrive, what they did, one of the first things they did with Bandera, is they said, you have to revoke that proclamation. Bandera refused, and so he was arrested by the Gestapo, and he was thrown into jail. As were much of the OUN's leadership. Few of them would ever come out of jail alive, including two of Bandera's brothers. They were sent to Auschwitz, and they died there. Again, a complicated history. Now, when the Germans were withdrawing and the Russians were coming back in, the Nazis decided it would be a good idea that maybe they could use Bandera, who had been kind of under house arrest in Berlin, as a partisan force, as a Ukrainian force to fight against the Russians, which of course Bandera was happy to do. He signed up, he got in uniform, he formed a battalion, an SS battalion, and there's conflicting reports of what he did when he was actually actively fighting on Ukrainian soil. There's also conflicting reports about whether or not he took part in sending Jews to the camps. Certainly, however, he was aware of what the SS was doing on this land when it came to the Jewish community, and for me that's a red line. You know, once you either turn a blind eye or actively participate in the Holocaust, there's no going back from that. But what kind of blew back on the Nazis was the fact that Bandera took up arms against the Germans as well as the Russians. But it has to be said, Bandera's first and foremost enemy was Russia because of the brutality and the relationship between Russia and Ukraine. Russia and Moscow has always been seen as enemy number one, and it was that way for Bandera. It is not just in this war that the Ukrainians consider Russia to be their primary enemy. This is Shyptyski Cemetery in central Lviv, and this is where they bury their honored war dead. This is an existential war for Ukraine, whether or not there will be a country and a people called Ukraine. And so right now it's all hands on deck. And I debated long and hard about whether to include what I'm about to include, because I don't like to give oxygen to what is, in effect, a minority group. But I would also be lying if I didn't show this. Unlike the Azov Brigade, there is a group in Ukraine that does hold some very dangerous and reprehensible ideas. They're called the right sector, or the Privvy Sektor. This grave here is a member of that group. And I'm about to show you a funeral in Lviv for one of their members, and it may be disturbing to some to see it because it looks like they're a major force to be reckoned with because they came out in numbers. But they aren't. This is a country of 40 million people. And as a matter of fact, they have fought against the authorities in Kiev in the past. After the signing of the 2015 anti-fascist and communist propaganda law, there were authorities under Petro Poroshenko that fought against the Privvy Sektor militia members, and in those clashes 2 people were killed. So to say that they are a dominant factor within the country is just simply not true. Nevertheless, unlike Russia, Ukraine believes in showing itself warts and all. And so I will follow along in that belief. And I will show this funeral. But just keep in mind, while they look scary, they're a very small minority group. So those are the guys maybe we should be really worried about. And okay, it might look like they're a significant part of this country, but they're not. They were showing up in numbers at that funeral because it was the death of their deputy commander, but that's pretty much the extent of their membership. So why is it that Moscow's so fixated on the Azov Brigade and doesn't really hardly ever talk about the Privvy Sektor? Well, it might be because the Azovs gave them a real shellacking back in 2014, and they're still a little bit bent out of shape about it, just as much as right now the Azov are giving them what for in Mariupol. But I think it's important to recognize that increasingly this kind of mentality is decreasing in Ukraine. Because just as Moscow isn't going to be the arbiter of what it is to be a Slav, well, folks like the Bandera followers who really believe in his narrative, or the Privvy Sektor, they don't get to be the ones who determine who is a Ukrainian. And increasingly, as they fight this war in the last 2 months or so, they're increasingly becoming united. Doesn't matter where you come from in Ukraine, doesn't matter what your ethnic origin is, your cultural origin is, or even indeed your sexual orientation. Liberal democracy, those ideals, it's really taking hold here. And this kind of idea that there's a good Ukrainian and a bad Ukrainian and some group gets to decide it, well, that is dying off. And you know, those people who are telling Moscow's line, the Kremlin's line, that this place is full of Nazis, they would know that. They would know that that kind of idea is diminishing here if they only just came here. But they won't, will they? We have something other than a monument as our backdrop to discuss things. This is the beautiful 18th century Cathedral of St. George in Lviv, Ukraine. It is the center, one of the primary centers of the Orthodox Church here. And I'm here because I want to talk about two priests of the Orthodox Church who were contemporaries of Stepan Bandera, the Shyptyski brothers, Andrei and Clemente. And unlike Bandera, who responded to the horrors and the trauma of the 21st century with violence, the Shyptyski brothers responded with love and kindness and compassion. I want to talk about Clemente in particular because, like his brother, Clemente was beatified by the Catholic Church, but Clemente also received honored among nations status by the state of Israel because Clemente saved the lives of many, many Jews, including the chief rabbi of Ukraine. Now, Russians will chew your ear off about Bandera, and indeed Bandera was a leader on the Ukrainian stage at this time, but so were the Shyptykis. And how was Clemente rewarded for his acts of kindness by the Soviets? Well, he was arrested at the end of the war, sent to a gulag where he eventually, of course, would die, imprisoned. All right, so let's wrap this up. I'm sure this video is long enough already as it is, but it's a complicated topic. And I'm sure that when I put this out in the world, there are going to be people who say, oh, yes, but you've got this important part of history, or, oh, yeah, you mentioned that, but you don't really understand it, you didn't get it right. And I think that's actually partly by design. I think that there are a lot of powers that have used the history of this place for their own designs. But before I get to that, let's finish up where we started with the story of Stepan Bandera. How did he end up, and what is his legacy? Well, at the end of the war, as the Soviets reclaimed this territory and the Germans fled, Bandera fled as well. And in the post-war world, he went to go live in Munich. But eventually the Russians and the Soviets would catch up with him. And in 1959, he dropped dead on the streets of Munich. An autopsy revealed that he died of cyanide poisoning. For some reason, the Russians really love to use poison. What's his legacy? Well, his legacy is complicated. And it's complicated internally within Ukraine itself. I mean, here in Lviv, we've got the statue here, and the street named after him, and portraits of him all around the town. Maybe that's because he is a native son of this region. You will not see Bandera's portraits or monuments to him in Kiev or Odessa, and certainly not out in the east. So he's controversial here internally. But you know who loves to use Bandera? The Russians. They love to use him, I don't think because they actually care about Stepan Bandera, but because they can then use that and talk about his current day followers, the Banderovцы, as obviously espousing his same fascist and anti-Semitic and violent rhetoric. People who do follow him here, there might be some who do hold those kind of beliefs, but there are some here who believe, first and foremost, he was a Ukrainian nationalist, and they sympathize with that. They fall in line with that. And they also say his story's been manipulated. And they're right, it has been, clearly. And that's kind of the point, is that this country has had its story told from external sources for centuries. You know, internally we tell our own story to ourselves and kind of the greater powers of the world. In America, we still contend with the legacy of slavery in a country where we claim to believe that all men are created equal. We struggle with that. In Britain, they struggle with the legacy of colonization and a belief in democracy conflicting with that. When eventually this country is fully independent and it is ratified by the blood of those who are fighting today. And that is why they are fighting so hard currently, because they want to tell their own story in their own words. That is incredibly powerful. They have not had that opportunity except for a couple of brief moments in history. And that's one of the reasons, just one of the reasons, why I think we need to stand with the Ukrainians now, today. Because ultimately, they deserve to be able to tell their own story, warts and all. But they can't do it if they're always under the thumb of some other power. Now is the time for Ukraine to stand up, be its own country, for Ukrainians to have a home, and for them to tell the narrative of what it is to be Ukraine. Slava Ukraine. Geroyam Slava.